"I thought some quiet time would help him settle down," my sister said after locking my son 3 hours in her basement. I reported to CPS, and now they involved. I'm 35, and what happened at my sister Brenda's house during my nephew's birthday party still haunts me. It was supposed to be a joyful family gathering, but it turned into a nightmare that would forever change our family dynamics. That morning, my son Kevin had woken up feeling under the weather. He had a slight fever and complained of a headache, but he was desperate to attend his cousin's party. Kevin and his cousin were close, almost like brothers, and he didn't want to miss the celebration. After checking his temperature, it was only slightly elevated at 99, 2 degrees F, and seeing his enthusiasm, I decided to let him go, thinking the excitement of the party might actually lift his spirits. I packed some children's Tylenol in his backpack, just in case, and made sure he had his emergency phone. "Remember, buddy," I told him as we pulled up to Brenda's house, "if you start feeling worse, just call me right away. I can come get you anytime." He nodded, already distracted by the colorful balloons decorating the front porch and the sound of children laughing inside. The house was beautifully decorated with a superhero theme that Kevin loved. Streamers hung from every doorway, and there was a massive cake in the shape of Captain America's shield on the dining room table. Brenda greeted us at the door. She had always been a perfectionist when it came to hosting events, often taking things to extreme levels to ensure everything went according to her precise plans. I should have seen this as a warning sign, but at the time, I just attributed it to her usual party planning enthusiasm. "Kevin, honey," she exclaimed, hugging him, "all your friends are in the backyard playing superhero tag. Why don't you join them?" As Kevin ran off, I pulled her aside to explain his condition. "Brenda, Kevin's been feeling a bit sick today. He has his phone with him in case he needs to call me, and there's some Tylenol in his backpack if his fever comes back." She waved dismissively. "Oh, he'll be fine. Kids always act a little sick when they're excited. Besides, I have a strict no-phone policy during parties. Can't have the kids glued to their screens instead of participating in the activities I've planned." Before I could protest, she had already snatched Kevin's backpack and phone, placing them in a basket with all the other confiscated devices. I felt uneasy but didn't want to make a scene. I reminded myself that Brenda was a mother too. Surely she would keep an eye on him. "I'll be back to pick him up at 6, I said. "Please call me if he starts feeling worse." The next few hours were relatively normal. I ran some errands, did some housework, and occasionally checked my phone for messages. Around 3 p.m., I started feeling anxious. Something didn't feel right. I tried calling Brenda, but the calls went straight to voicemail. I texted her, but there was no response. By 4 p.m., my maternal instincts were screaming that something was wrong. I decided to head over early. As I pulled up to the house, I could hear music and laughter from the backyard. Children were running around, parents were chatting, and everything looked perfectly normal on the surface. But when I walked in, I immediately noticed Kevin's absence among the playing children. Brenda seemed startled when she saw me. She was in the kitchen arranging snacks on a platter and nearly dropped it when I walked in. "Oh, you're early," she said, her voice pitched slightly higher than normal. "We're just about to do the cake and presents." "Where's Kevin?" I asked, scanning the room. She avoided my eyes. "Oh, he's just taking a little break. You know how overwhelming parties can be." That's when I noticed how nervous she looked. I pushed past her, ignoring her protests that I should wait in the living room while she went to get him. As we walked through the house, she began explaining in a rushed, defensive tone. According to her, Kevin had started complaining about feeling sick during the superhero games. He had asked repeatedly to call me, but she was convinced he was just trying to get attention. When he threw up in the bathroom, she accused him of making himself sick on purpose to ruin her son's party. He was being dramatic, she insisted as we walked. "I thought some quiet time would help him settle down." "Quiet time?" I asked, my voice dangerously low. "What do you mean by quiet time?" That's when she led me to the basement door. My heart stopped when I realized it was locked from the outside. The basement, where she stored her holiday decorations and rarely used furniture, was known for being cold and damp. She had locked my sick child in there alone for hours. The moment she unlocked the door, I could feel the cold air rushing up from below. Kevin was huddled in a corner, wrapped in his own arms. His face was pale except for two bright fever spots on his cheeks, and there were dried tear tracks on his face. Several spots on the floor showed where he had been sick. "Daddy," he whimpered when he saw me. I ran down the stairs, nearly tripping in my haste to reach him. He was burning up with fever, his clothes damp with sweat, and he could barely stand. When I picked him up, I could feel him trembling against me, whether from cold or fear, I couldn't tell. "How could you?" I screamed at Brenda, who stood at the top of the stairs, wringing her hands. "He's sick. He could have got pneumonia down here. What is wrong with you?" "I didn't think," she started, but I cut her off. "No, you didn't think. You didn't think about his health, his safety, or his well-being. You only thought about your perfect party and your perfect schedule." I carried Kevin up the stairs, past my sister, and through the house. Parents and children stopped their celebrations to stare as I rushed past with my shaking, sick child. I could hear whispers, see the shocked looks on their faces. Brenda followed us, trying to explain, to justify her actions, but I ignored her. The drive to the emergency room was a blur. Kevin dozed fitfully in the backseat while I alternated between checking on him in the rearview mirror and calling his pediatrician to explain the situation. Brenda followed in her car, continuing to call my phone, which I ignored. At the hospital, the doctors diagnosed Kevin with a severe case of flu, exacerbated by exposure to cold and stress. His temperature had spiked to 103, 8 degrees F, and he was showing signs of dehydration. As they hooked him up to an IV and began treatment, I sat by his bed, holding his hand and fighting back tears of rage and guilt. That's when my father and brother-in-law arrived. They had heard about the incident from other party guests and came immediately. Brenda had tried to downplay what happened, but the truth came out quickly. My brother-in-law, usually a quiet, reserved man, exploded with anger when he learned what his wife had done. "You locked a sick child in our basement," he shouted, his face red with fury. "What kind of monster does that?" My father, who had always been the family peacekeeper, stood silent for a long moment, looking at his youngest daughter with an expression I had never seen before, a mixture of disappointment, disgust, and resolve. "I've been meeting with my lawyer," he said quietly, his voice carrying more weight than if he had shouted. "I was planning to set up trust funds for all of you to help secure your futures, but after this," he shook his head, "the money will go to my grandchildren, all of it, and you, Brenda, won't see a penny, not after what you did to my grandson." Brenda collapsed into tears, but they weren't the manipulative sobs I had seen her use before to get her way. These were the broken cries of someone who finally realized the magnitude of their actions and their consequences. I cut all contact with Brenda after that day. Some family members tried to encourage reconciliation, saying she had learned her lesson, but I couldn't risk my son's well-being again. Her actions showed a fundamental lack of empathy and judgment that I couldn't forgive. Update 1. Hi everyone, first of all, thank you so much for all the comments about Kevin's health. The weeks following the birthday party incident were some of the most challenging of my life. Kevin was slowly recovering physically, but the emotional trauma lingered. My wife Sarah and I took turns staying with him through these episodes, holding him close and assuring him he was safe. During this time, I struggled with what actions to take regarding my sister. The rage I felt hadn't subsided. If anything, it had grown stronger as I watched my son struggle with the aftermath of her cruelty. Several people, including my wife, suggested reporting the incident to Child Protective Services. "We should file a report," my wife said one evening after we'd finally gotten Kevin to sleep. "What she did was abuse, plain and simple. What if she does something like this to another child?" But I was hesitant, not because I didn't think Brenda deserved consequences, but because I wanted to focus all our energy on helping Kevin heal. The thought of dealing with investigations and interviews seemed overwhelming when our son needed us so completely. I decided to block Brenda's number and on all social media. It wasn't an easy decision. We'd grown up together, shared countless memories, and despite everything, she was still my sister. But every time my phone buzzed with her calls or messages, I felt my blood pressure rise. Her constant attempts to contact me were just another source of stress we didn't need. The morning after I blocked her, I was in the kitchen making breakfast for Kevin when Sarah called out from the living room. "Mark, she's here." Brenda was standing at our front door, repeatedly pressing the doorbell. Sarah had already told her through the door that she wasn't welcome, but Brenda refused to leave. "Please," she called out, her voice carrying through the door. "I just need 5 minutes. I need to explain." Kevin, hearing her voice, immediately tensed up. He abandoned his half-eaten breakfast and pressed himself against the kitchen wall, as far from the front door as he could get. The fear in his eyes made my decision for me. "Stay with him," I told Sarah, squeezing her hand before heading to the door. When I opened it, Brenda tried to push her way inside, but I blocked her path. "You have 2 minutes," I said coldly. "Say what you need to say, then leave." Brenda started crying immediately, something she'd always done when she wanted to manipulate a situation. "I'm sorry," she sobbed. "I know what I did was wrong, but you don't understand what it's like." "What's like?" I demanded. "What could possibly justify locking a sick child in a basement?" That's when she said something that made my blood run cold. Through her tears, she spat out, "I hate him. I hate that Dad loves him more than he ever loved my kids, just like he always loved you more than me." I stood there, stunned by her admission. She continued, her voice rising hysterically. "Ever since Kevin was born, Dad's been obsessed with him. He comes to every one of his baseball games, but he missed my son's piano recital. He remembers Kevin's birthday, but forgot his last year. It's not fair." "So you locked my son in a basement because you're jealous." I could barely get the words out, I was so angry. "He could have gotten seriously ill, he could have been injured, and you did this because you're jealous of a child." "You don't understand," she insisted. "You've always been the favorite, Dad's golden child, and now Kevin is too, and my kids are just an afterthought. When Dad announced the trust fund changes, it just proved what I've always known. He loves your family more than mine." I had to grip the doorframe to keep from shaking. "Let me be very clear," I said, my voice low and dangerous. "Your feelings about Dad's perceived favoritism do not justify what you did to my son. You're a mother. How would you feel if someone locked your son in a cold basement for hours while they were sick?" "That's different," she protested. "No, it's not, and the fact that you think it is shows exactly why you shouldn't be anywhere near my family." Sarah appeared behind me then, her face tight with anger. "Kevin is terrified right now," she said quietly. "He can hear your voice and he's having a panic attack. You need to leave now." Brenda tried to look past us, probably trying to see Kevin, but I moved to block her view completely. "You need to go," I said. "And don't come back. If you try to contact us again, or if you come to our house uninvited, we will call the police and file for a restraining order." As I closed the door, she started screaming about how we were destroying the family, how we were turning everyone against her. I could hear her all the way back in the kitchen, where I found Kevin curled up in Sarah's arms, shaking. That evening, after Kevin had finally fallen asleep, Sarah and I had a long discussion about next steps. We decided that while we wouldn't immediately pursue legal action, we would document everything that had happened, the incident itself, Brenda's confession of deliberately harming Kevin out of jealousy, and her unannounced visit to our house. "We need to be prepared," Sarah said. "If she's willing to hurt Kevin because she's jealous of your dad's attention, who knows what else she might do." I agreed, and the next day, we started the process of legally protecting our family. We installed security cameras around the house and informed Kevin's school that Brenda was not authorized to pick him up under any circumstances. We also spoke with a lawyer about the possibility of a restraining order if needed. My father's decision to remove Brenda from his trust fund had clearly pushed her over the edge, but it had also exposed her true colors. Her admission that she had deliberately hurt Kevin out of jealousy showed that this wasn't just a momentary lapse in judgment. It was a calculated act of cruelty motivated by her own emotional issues. Update 2. I decided to talk to my father first. Despite his anger over the incident and his decision about the trust fund, I wasn't sure how he'd feel about involving Child Protective Services. After all, this could have serious consequences for Brenda's own children. Sarah and I drove to his house one evening after Kevin was asleep at my mother-in-law's. Dad was in his study, looking older than I'd ever seen him. The incident had taken a visible toll on him. His usually immaculate silver hair was disheveled, and there were new worry lines around his eyes. "Dad," I started, settling into one of the leather chairs across from his desk. "We need to talk about something important." Sarah sat beside me, holding my hand for support. "We're thinking about reporting Brenda to CPS." He looked up sharply, his reading glasses sliding down his nose. "CPS?" he repeated, his voice carefully neutral. "Yes," I continued. "What she did to Kevin, it wasn't just a mistake or a momentary lapse in judgment. She admitted to me that she did it deliberately out of jealousy." I went on to tell him about Brenda's visit to our house, her shocking admission about hating Kevin because of Dad's perceived favoritism. As I spoke, I watched my father's face crumble. He removed his glasses and pressed his fingers against his eyes. "This is my fault," he said quietly. "If I hadn't shown such obvious preference." "No," I interrupted firmly. "This isn't your fault, Dad. Yes, maybe there were issues with favoritism that should have been addressed, but that doesn't excuse what she did. She's an adult, a mother. She made a conscious decision to harm a sick child." Dad was silent for a long moment, staring at the family photos on his desk. I could see him looking at one in particular, a picture of Brenda and me as children, grinning at the camera with ice cream-stained faces. "You're right," he finally said, his voice heavy. "What she did was abuse, and if you don't report it, who's to say she won't do something similar to another child, maybe even her own kids?" He looked up at us, his eyes firm despite the pain in them. "Do what you need to do. You have my support." With Dad's blessing, we moved forward with the report. The process was more intensive than I'd expected. The initial call to CPS took over an hour as I detailed everything that had happened at the party, including times, temperatures, and witnesses. The intake worker was particularly concerned about the premeditated nature of the incident and Brenda's lack of remorse. 2 days later, we met with the assigned caseworker. She did ask about the delay in reporting, her pen pausing on her notepad. "I understand this is your sister," she said carefully, "but in cases of child abuse, immediate reporting is crucial. Can you explain why you waited?" Sarah and I exchanged looks. "Honestly," I admitted, "we were focused on helping Kevin recover both physically and emotionally, and—" I hesitated. I guess part of me was hoping this was somehow salvageable, that my sister couldn't have really meant to hurt him. But after she came to our house and admitted she did it out of jealousy, we knew we had to report it. She nodded, making more notes. "And Kevin, how is he doing now?" "He's still having nightmares," Sarah replied. "He's seeing a child therapist twice a week. He's afraid of basements, of being alone, and he panics if he can't immediately contact us." The hardest part was when Kevin had to be interviewed. The CPS office had a special room for child interviews, decorated with cheerful artwork and stocked with toys, but Kevin still clung to my hand when we arrived. Kevin was brave, answering questions about what happened in the basement. He described how cold it was, how scared he felt, how he'd called for help but no one came. How Aunt Brenda had taken his phone and medicine away, how she'd told him to stop being dramatic when he said he felt sick. By the end of the interview, Sarah and I were both in tears. The investigation moved quickly after that. The caseworker interviewed other parents who had been at the party, confirming that Kevin had been missing for several hours and that Brenda had dismissed concerns about his whereabouts. When she interviewed Brenda, the report we received was troubling. Brenda had maintained that she'd done nothing wrong, that Kevin had been acting out and needed discipline. She showed no remorse and even suggested that Kevin was lying about how sick he'd been. Her attitude only reinforced that we'd made the right decision in reporting her. 2 weeks into the investigation, the caseworker called to update us. CPS was taking the case very seriously, particularly given Brenda's lack of remorse and the premeditated nature of her actions. They were also conducting welfare checks on her own children, concerned about her capacity for caring for any child given her admitted jealousy and willingness to cause harm. The whole process was emotionally draining, but I knew we'd done the right thing. This wasn't about family loyalty anymore. It was about protecting children, including Brenda's own kids, from someone who had demonstrated she was willing to abuse a child out of spite. Dad stood by us throughout the investigation, even providing his own statement to CPS about Brenda's visit to our house and her admission of deliberately harming Kevin. "I enabled her behavior for years," he told me one evening. "Maybe if I'd addressed her jealousy issues earlier, it wouldn't have come to this. But now all we can do is make sure she can't hurt any other children." The investigation was ongoing, but we'd been assured that our report would help establish a pattern of behavior if Brenda ever harmed another child. It wasn't the outcome I'd ever expected from my nephew's birthday party, but it was necessary. Sometimes protecting children means making hard choices, even when those choices involve family. I also realized that sometimes love doesn't mean turning a blind eye to someone's wrongdoings. Love means holding people accountable, even when it hurts. My responsibility was to protect my child, and I couldn't allow anyone, not even family, to stand in the way of that. In the end, I've learned that family isn't just about blood. It's about trust, respect, and understanding. And when someone violates that trust, it's okay to walk away, no matter how painful it may be. I've learned that protecting my child is my top priority, and that sometimes healing means cutting ties with the people who hurt you. As for my sister, I don't know what the future holds. I hope she seeks help and works through her issues, but I can't be the one to fix her. She has to do that on her own. My family, for now, consists of those who show love, respect, and care for my son's well-being, and that's who I will continue to invest my time and energy in. The hardest lesson I learned through all of this is that no matter how much you love someone, you have to be willing to set boundaries and take action when necessary. The well-being of my family is non-negotiable.